Jimmy was a great guy. He was funny, smart, had a good soul, a good heart.
I tell Mommy, we're really excited because we might get to go up and see her.
Nikki seemed like a nice girl.
We were so happy for him.
Say hi, Daddy.
But she was having to take pain medication.
He was genuinely concerned. I don't think he ever imagined it, that he was going to have to investigate his own wife.
Her personality was starting to change.
He called and was telling me I was real nauseous and drowsy.
We're here to check the welfare of a James Cabela.
Something is up. This woman is not acting right.
She was...
Ladies and gentlemen, groomsman James Cabela!
This is Jimmy, my brother, being introduced as part of the wedding party at my husband and I's wedding.
Smiling, getting ready to start dancing, having a good time.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, a round of applause for your bridal party.
Jimmy was a great guy. He was funny, smart. He had a good soul, a good heart.
Here is Nikki being presented as Mrs. Capello, and she's a little shy at first.
The month prior, they had just gotten married themselves and seemed like a happy couple.
We were so happy for him.
Nikki seemed like a nice girl. Yeah, it was nice to see Jimmy happy.
Jimmy Capello was born on May 27, 1981, in Buffalo, New York.
He was an ambitious kid, easygoing. He was always pretty happy. He always laughed a lot. He was able to relate well with people. Played a little bit of sports. He liked cars.
Jimmy was a goof. He can make people laugh. He can make people smile. You're having a bad day, he can turn that right around for you.
Unfortunately, Jimmy's parents' marriage breaks down while he and Jamie are still young. When he is 18, Jimmy and his mother leave New York State, eventually settling in Huntsville, Alabama.
By that point, I was in nursing school. We would talk on the phone, and he was a talker. And thankfully, I was a listener.
In 2006, a friend of Jimmy offers him a new career opportunity.
Jimmy sort of fell into private investigation. It wasn't something that he reached out to. It sort of landed on his lap. He entertained it, realized he was really good at it.
Oh, I was excited for him. Jimmy was great at his job. He dove right into it.
On June 16, 2008, Jimmy's personal life changes too.
Jimmy met Nikki when he was 27 years old.
He was riding his motorcycle and saw her on the corner. I think she was in the car, and I guess they locked eyes. He turned his motorcycle around and introduced himself.
Jimmy was very excited to introduce Nikki to us. We flew into Alabama. Nikki ended up picking us up at the airport.
She was so silly and so giddy and so nervous. She was studying nursing, and I was a nurse. It gave Nikki and I something to talk about instantly. They were happy, holding hands, hugging. I felt like she was a great person for him. I think he knew within himself that he was going to marry her, and he acted on that very quickly. Jimmy and Nikki got married in July 2010 in Huntsville, Alabama. Beautiful wedding. It's the end of the night, and it's time for them to depart.
They're both on bikes. It was Jimmy's idea. Then Jimmy stops and does a burnout, and they're off in the sunset, or the sun down.
Just 4 weeks later, Jamie marries Florida-based firefighter Chris Weiss.
Jimmy was a groomsman in our wedding, and he was pretty good at keeping me calm. You know, here's another drink, try to relax, you know. It was a really good time.
I was excited for him. Thought Chris was a great guy, and Jimmy was in love with Nikki.
It was a good year. It was a good year for us. Nikki took her boards the same month that they got married, and soon after, she was working at a local hospital. So here we are in 2015, and Jimmy starts his own practice, private investigation practice. He was one of the top agencies in the community. Everyone wanted to use him.
4 years into their marriage, Jimmy and Nikki deliver some welcome news.
We were in Buffalo, New York at this time for a visit, and we were at my grandparents' house, and I went upstairs to use the restroom. My oldest son comes walking to me and hands me a little piece of paper. And in that little piece of paper, which I still have, says, Aunt Nikki and Uncle Jimmy are expecting a baby. I was so excited.
On August 5th, 2014, Nikki gives birth to a baby girl. They name her Riley.
This is Riley as an infant. Hiccups and all. Diaper that's too big for her.
And you can hear him saying shh and tapping her on the belly like it's gonna be okay.
As Riley grows, Jimmy and Nikki balance parenting and work.
And I tell Mommy we're really excited because we might get to go up and see her. See her in work action. In work action.
Say hi, Daddy. I'm helping Mommy cook, because I can't be put down.
Even when the other one was working, she was sending video clips of Riley to him. He was sending video clips of Riley to her.
See, we tried FaceTiming you, but you didn't answer, so we're just going to send you a video. See, it's about bath time. Is that Riley? Can you say hi, Daddy? Say hi, Daddy.
They were over the moon.
This is Christmas in Buffalo with the whole family, all the grandkids, excited about opening all their gifts. I think Riley was possibly about a year old. It was great to meet and keep the kids in contact with each other.
But you are never prepared for how much money it takes to provide for another human being. I remember a visit up in Alabama. Riley was just a little bit older at this point. They were having a little bit of financial trouble. We helped them out a little bit. And I remember one afternoon, my brother was working when Nikki suggested, hey, let's go to this outdoor mall. They have restaurants there. And I'll never forget one of the stores that we walked into, and she bought a watch, and the watch wasn't cheap. It caught me off guard. You're experiencing a little bit of financial hardship, but you bought something for yourself. I thought it was a little bit of a selfish move. I don't think Jimmy ever knew about that purchase, and it made me wonder what else he didn't know? What else she did without him knowing?
Now with a growing family, Jimmy Capello throws himself into life as a father and husband.
Where's that, Riley?
But Jamie becomes aware of an ongoing problem of Nikki's.
We would be walking together where she would like walk a little bit funny, make a little grimace. And I said, well, what's going on? Oh, it was an injury that occurred before.
First time I asked Jimmy, he was genuinely concerned. He wants to figure out what's causing it.
Say mama, mama. Say mama. No? Sorry. But, yep, all's good.
He's like, let's get massages done. Let's go for physical therapy. Let's exercise. We got to figure this out. She was having to take pain medication, and my brother was concerned. She wasn't getting relief.
Soon after, Jimmy's concerns turn to alarm. He discovers Nikki is leading a double life.
He had found out that she opened up a bank account without him knowing. Different purchases that were made that he didn't know about, and that she had contacted an ex of hers. So they started having some trust issues.
In 2016, 6 years into their marriage, Jimmy finds a disturbing set of messages on Nikki's phone.
He had found out that she had contacted a drug dealer. Now she's meeting people off the streets for pain medication. But even worse, in the message thread, she had asked this drug dealer, is it safe if my daughter is with me? Because I have my daughter with me. Jimmy was so upset. He put a quick halt to it. He's expressing this to me in a phone conversation that he's so confused. What do I do? I struggled with trying to find the right words to help him through this. As a mother, how could you in so many ways?
I was furious, I was mad. Right, for better or worse is a thing, but when you're willfully taking advantage of people and putting your child in danger, it's unacceptable.
I started questioning if I even really knew who Nikki was. Maybe I didn't know her at all. But Jimmy still wanted to work on the relationship. They had a daughter. He still wanted this white picket fence, and he wanted that with her.
Nikki promises to make a change, but over the following months, other people start to notice strange behavior.
She was falling asleep at work, and she would leave the unit, not come back for some time. Manager pulled her into the office, and they said, your behavior at work is concerning. You no longer have a job. She told Jimmy, but it was downplayed, and it was more of the employer's fault than her fault.
With his wife now out of work and their income slashed, Jimmy carries all the responsibility for his family.
Jimmy worked 60, 70, 80 hours a week and was gone for long hours. And on the cameras that they have inside their home, there's Nikki on the couch while Riley's unsupervised, just walking around the house, you know, doing what she wants, watching TV, getting into stuff. Been a fireman for 20 years, and children left unsupervised can be a terrible thing.
You gonna do a cannonball?
With Nikki under the influence of pain medication at home, Jimmy often has no choice but to bring Riley to work with him.
You're silly.
This was around the time when Jimmy was growing more concerned about Nikki.
It was taking a toll on their marriage, trying to put all your energy in both ends of your life, your work life, and still trying to keep Riley stable.
Much to Jimmy's relief, a glimmer of hope appears in the summer of 2017.
Nikki gets this new position at this other hospital. She's going to be a charge nurse and maybe even become a manager. She's excited. He's excited. Maybe this will help her.
Nikki's pain seems to lessen. and her new job quickly eases the couple's financial stress.
The house that they were in, neighborhood, I thought was getting a little bit sketchy in here. So they moved to a little upper scaled neighborhood. It was bigger house, bigger garage.
With Nikki now working, Jimmy finds more time for himself.
Plus dip is silver and I can't get that off, so I'm gonna sand it off. I'm probably gonna wrap it because it's actually pretty bad.
So at this point, Jimmy's moved on from motorcycles to cars. So he bought a Corvette.
Riley, it's learning time, right? What is this? Engine. What is this? What is this? Yeah, and what is this?
This is Riley spending time with her daddy in the garage, and he is quizzing her on the different parts of the car, asking her, what is this? She had a toy vehicle, and when he would be in the garage working on his car, he would also help her work on her car.
In April 2018, 10 months after Nikki starts her new job, the family gather for a celebration.
Nikki and Jimmy drove down to Florida for my grandkid's birthday.
And we're sitting at the table, and Nikki's sitting across from me, barely able to keep her eyes open.
She wasn't focused. She would be looking through you. She didn't know where she was.
Jimmy would say, let's go upstairs, and then like shuttle her off to bed, and then he would come down, sorry, she's just, she took her medicine and makes her tired.
So the boys went and had a couple beers at a local bar. And I remember sitting there on the couch, and the kids were in bed, and Nikki sat across. She never said a word. I don't think we spoke one word to each other. She couldn't keep her eyes open, and she was just on the couch, slumped over, breathing like 8 times a minute. I knew what this was. I could see it. Her personality was starting to change. She wasn't that bubbly person anymore. She was going down a deep, dark path, and Jimmy was losing hope that he could actually fix this situation. When that visit was over with, he called me the next day, and I said, Jimmy, this is concerning. We're at a dangerous point now. And he says, Jamie, I know. I don't want to be like Dad. I don't want to go through divorce. I said, you have got to know what she is taking.
I know it was breaking his heart. No, I don't think he ever imagined it, that he was going to have to investigate his own wife, but he did. He was able to start documenting everything that she was doing.
He starts sending me pictures of random things he's finding in her work bag. And he sent a picture of 2 pills, oxycodones. They were still in their original paper wrap. And I said, Jimmy, this is only a medication you can get from the hospital. I said, she stole that. That is not good.
Jimmy finds drugs that are not typically used for abuse.
Why in the world would she have a bottle of insulin? Why would she have a box of Lancets? Lancets are used when you're a diabetic to get a little blood sample. I mean, this was a big puzzle.
Summer 2018. The whole family gather in Huntsville for Riley's 4th birthday.
The party was going great. Kids were having a blast.
Come on, JJ.
I just noticed Nikki was off. She didn't participate. I don't know if it was because she wasn't getting attention. It just seemed like there was an issue.
She was irritable, getting short with Riley. Jimmy tries to get Nikki in a better mood. So he tries to shove her into the baby pool, you know, as a joke, get her wet. And oh no, she didn't like that. She immediately went inside the house, went in the kitchen cupboard, and took a pill. Jimmy is feeling all kinds of emotions, all kinds of desperation. He wanted her off the medications.
In the following days, however, Nikki's behavior suddenly changes.
He says, I went in her work bag, not even an alcohol swab in her work bag. Nothing. At this point, I believe that Nikki was in fear and was trying to figure out a way around the situation.
On September 11th, 2018, James Capello gets a worrying call from his son.
He called and was telling me, he says, God, I felt horrible yesterday. I couldn't focus. I was real nauseous and drowsy.
He was talking about the confusion. He was so confused. He said he couldn't even count money. He talked about how he fell down the stairs.
I was set back. I was really surprised. He was fairly healthy. He never had really any issues. He said, I feel fine now. I said, well, you should go get checked out.
Jimmy was convinced that Nikki was drugging him. He was so convinced that he said to me, Jamie, if anything happens to me, you are to get Riley. And I thought, that's ridiculous. I didn't believe that Nikki was drugging him. She is a nurse.
After talking to his family, Jimmy returns to work. But a week later, he messages Jamie again.
I was at work. I get a text message from Jimmy a little after 10 o'clock at night. And it said, today sucked. I had another episode. I called him. And he answered the phone. And he was anxious. He couldn't form his words correctly. Nikki gets on the phone, and I'm like, what is going on? And she said, what Jimmy is experiencing are classic signs of hypoglycemia. And I said, please, 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 take him to the doctor tomorrow. Please. She said, I will, I'll take care of him.
Jamie calls Jimmy first thing the following morning.
He doesn't answer his phone. So I text her. I said, hey, how is he? She said, oh, he's doing fine. He woke up and he went off to work. So at this point, I'm thinking he's doing what he's doing. She's gonna get him to the doctor and it was gonna be okay.
But despite what Nikki tells Jamie, Jimmy doesn't make it to work. His colleagues contact the police.
The Huntsville Police Department first got a call about Jimmy from his coworkers, probably between 9 and midnight, Thursday night. Just saying that we'd like to do a welfare check. He's not been at work like he's supposed to be.
It's 8013, nobody's answering the door, so all the lights are on, both cars in the driveway, dog's barking his head off.
Finally, they get some sort of remote doorbell thing where Nikki Capello answers.
We're here to check the welfare of a James Cabela.
This is his wife. He's been missing.
Can you come talk to us at the door, please? Hey.
Sorry.
How long have y'all not heard from him?
I saw him this morning at 5. My daughter woke me up at 9. And he was at home, and I assumed that he had gone to work with his coworkers. But apparently nobody's heard from him. All of his stuff is here. He would normally take everything. It's just odd. When can I file a missing person?
You can now if you want.
I may wait until tomorrow, see if he turns up.
Okay.
I don't know where he would have gone or anything like that.
Okay. Well, like I said, if you want to file it now or if you want to wait, it's up to you. If not tonight, we'll get out of your hair and let you get back to sleep.
She seemed completely unfazed that police were there in the middle of the night to say people are worried about your husband and we don't know where he is. It did not seem to ping her radar at all.
It's weird. I think somebody got killed.
The next day rolls around, and I get a text message from my mom. Have you heard from Jimmy? He's missing. She said his car, his keys, his wallet, everything's at the house, but he's not there. I'm like, nobody's heard from him? This doesn't make any sense. I called Jimmy, he didn't answer. I called Nikki, and she picked up the phone. And I was like, Nikki, talk to me about this. Nikki didn't sound worried. She wasn't worried at all. I asked her, do we have the police department involved? She said that she was advised that it was best not to file a missing persons report yet. Not enough time has passed. I was so confused. And she said, Jamie, what if Jimmy doesn't come back? I have to worry about Riley and I. Her reactions were not normal for a husband that was missing. And I just said, I'll call you later.
By mid-morning, with growing pressure from Jimmy's family and co-workers, Nikki finally calls in a missing persons report.
So they send another patrol officer out there just to check the house.
Does James Capello live here?
Nikki is at her mother's house.
They can't communicate real well through the doorbell. Finally says, look, give me your number and I'll just call you.
And he doesn't have anything going on where he may have gone out of town for something?
No, sir. I searched both his vehicles. Obviously, he wasn't in there. His work stuff was, along with his keys, wallet, and cell phone.
After the patrol officer talks to her, he calls the missing persons detective and says, look, boss, I can't prove it, but something is up. This woman is not acting right.
I kept in contact with Nikki, trying to figure out what everyone is doing, what she's doing. Nikki must have known that I wasn't getting the answers I wanted. I said, okay, I'm coming up. I'm leaving in the morning. The drive was long. I was calling fire departments and gonna get a search party together. I made a missing persons flyer.
We thought maybe he just was confused and walked out the door, had another episode. So we were loading up like we're going to Trump's through the woods.
At the same time, I had flashbacks of these hypoglycemic episodes that Nikki herself diagnosed him of having. And I remember this picture of the insulin bottle, and Jimmy saying that Nikki was drugging him.
Insulin is used to moderate blood sugar levels in people who are diabetic. If someone was given insulin who didn't need it, it could drop their blood sugar to a dangerous level. And so I asked Jamie, do you think she gave him insulin?
With Jamie and Chris approaching from Florida, and James now flying in from Buffalo, police receive a shocking tip.
Out of the blue, they get a call from this woman, and she says, hey, I know Jimmy Capello's wife, Nikki Capello, and she just called me and told me that she killed him with insulin and that his body is in her garage. As soon as he hears that, the investigator calls patrol and says, I need the closest unit to the house to go pull Nikki Capello out and sit on her until I get there.
Nikki Capello comes out to the porch.
In an effort to speed this up, would you mind if I checked your house to make sure that your husband's not in a crawl space where he was working or something, or if he's upstairs and went into like an attic or something, then the heat got him. Do you understand what I'm saying? Let me back up and be clear for you. If there is an issue, it is okay. You are under no obligation to find it. You're not. It was my understanding that you were going to give me consent to look through your property to see if your husband get more. If that's a problem for you, that's okay.
When I arrived at the house, Nikki was sitting outside on the porch with the police. She saw me from the porch, but there was no acknowledgement. You know, I had a lot of anger going through me, and I was all revved up and ready to knock the door down.
Will you sit down and talk?
Nope. I'll tell you what we're going to do. We're going to take a ride right now, and I am going to get a search warrant and take that. That way you don't feel pressured. Right now, I'm not feeling comfortable because I feel like you feel pressured.
Investigators escort Nikki to CID.
Someone's gonna let me find out about my daughter, right?
Yes, we will make phone calls for your daughter as soon as I get down there. We get you someplace cool where we can talk.
If someone's home up here.
We'll see about all that. We'll handle all that once we get down there, okay? It's okay. Here. Here you go.
As soon as he's got the warrant, they go in, and as soon as he opens the front door, he says, "You can smell death." He goes straight to the garage. There's a Corvette that Jimmy was working on rebuilding.
There he is.
And in the passenger side of the Corvette is Jimmy's body. He's in his underwear. He's laying on a tarp that's half wrapped around his legs, and his legs are shoved halfway into the car. And the body is not rotting yet, but it is bloated. It was clear from the way the body was found that that is not where Jimmy had died. Somebody had put him in the tarp and pulled him into the garage and tried to lift him into the car and put him in the passenger seat. They'd gotten the legs in, but the torso was heavier than they'd anticipated, and so it was essentially a half-done job.
The scene is photographed. Jimmy's body is sent for autopsy, and officers carry out a search of the property.
In the bedside table on her side of the bed, they found a single unused insulin needle, which was collected and taken into evidence.
It wasn't until I arrived at the house that the detective tell us there is a body inside, and I lost it. My father was beside himself.
Well, I can't even describe it. It was just a big hole, you know, being driven into you.
We all knew in the back of our heads that Nikki did it.
Hey, Margaret.
Hi.
How are you? Oh, go ahead and get up off the floor for me for just a second. As of when you and I first met on the porch, you were very apprehensive to let the police into your garage. Why?
It's full of car parts. I would get chewed out.
When was the last time you were in the garage, Nikki? I want you to do me a favor. More than that, I want you to do yourself a favor. And your child a favor. This is going a path you don't want it to go because you are not being completely honest with me. And I know that for a fact. I'm trying to give you a chance to pump the brakes for a minute. Think about your child and yourself. And I'm going to ask you again. Why did you not want me in that garage? We both know the answer.
Because I found Jim.
Because what?
I found Jim.
Okay. You found Jim what?
I found Jim dead. And chased that Corvette. I chased the Corvette.
Nikki.
Sir.
I'm going to keep bringing this up to you.
I know, I've got Riley.
And now she's lost her dad. No matter what happens going forward, there is the path where we tell the truth, and we probably get better treatment throughout the system than we do if we maintain a lie that's going to unravel very, very easily. Why did you not tell us that body was in the garage?
I was scared.
Of?
I don't know, the way that it would look. I mean, I filed a missing persons report, and then dadgummit, he then took car in the garage. That is why I was scared. Before we go on, I want legal advice.
Do you want legal advice? I can't give you legal advice.
No, I was saying I would like to talk to a lawyer.
Okay.
Just to cover
And
my
that
butt.
is fine. That is
They
absolutely.
cover my butt, that's not me.
I had no doubt that would be your priority.
Ultimately, they have to cut off questioning. But at that point, they have enough. They have means, they have opportunity, they have an insulin needle in the house.
This officer is going to put you in handcuffs. We're going to walk you out, and you will be booked in the jail for murder.
Can I ask a question? When I do, I am on certain meds that I can't just immediately stop. I will go into withdrawal.
They have doctors at the jail that you can speak to. They have medical staff, and they can get you. If it's something you're prescribed and it's something you need, then they'll take care of you.
Can you tell, you said you're going to call Mom back.
I can. Yes,
Tell her to get Riley from...
I don't know. I think maybe Jamie.
I don't want Jamie to get Riley. I want my mother to get Riley.
Well, we'll work all that out. She may already have her. I don't know.
We obtained emergency custody from the courts for Riley. We made sure that she was in our hands, and we were not going to let her go.
Jamie shares with investigators her suspicions of what happened to Jimmy.
The word insulin keeps coming up. My first thought is, I need to learn about insulin.
The investigators were suspicious that Mr. Capello had died from an insulin overdose. Insulin is a very unstable substance, and so over time, the actual insulin will break down. So for someone who has committed murder, it would be in their best interest to allow a body to decompose over a couple of days so that that particular substance would no longer be detectable at a reliable level.
When I learned this, it's like a light bulb has gone on. And all of these weird things about the way Nikki Capello was pushing people away and was trying to buy time, it all makes perfect sense. But after Dr. Green probably saw the pallor on my face when she told me that she could not say it was insulin, I immediately jumped to, what about needle marks? Can you tell me where he was injected?
The needle that is used to inject insulin is of a very high gauge. So that means that the needle is extremely small. And it is very difficult to see a needle puncture from that type of needle on a person who is not decomposed. So to try to identify that on a person who is decomposed, whose skin has undergone sloughing and their body is now bloated, it is very difficult to identify any needle puncture marks of that size. Although I was not able to diagnose the cause of death as an insulin toxicity, I was able to rule out other disease processes such as heart disease, pulmonary disease, liver disease, kidney disease. None of his organs appeared to have any significant disease processes that were ongoing.
That is useful to our case because if I can show that it was nothing else but insulin, it's almost like trying to color a picture by only drawing around the shape that you're looking at. But this case made me nervous because we didn't have a smoking gun. We're never going to be able to prove positively that it was insulin. There was nobody that saw the murder. We have no eyewitnesses to anything. This is going to be a circumstantial case.
To Jimmy's family's horror, Nikki Capello is granted bail only days after Jimmy's body is found.
We lived on edge with the fear that she would remain free.
And all this time, just afraid. Is she gonna get off?
But several months after the murder, investigators receive a game-changing call from a friend of Nikki Capello.
That person says that about a week before Jimmy died, she was out at a barbecue at their house. She says she and Nikki were joking as people do, oh, I hate my husband, he'd be worth more to me dead, that kind of thing. And then Nikki tells her, I could kill him. She's like, I could use insulin. And then Nikki Capello looks at her and says, I actually tried last week. I don't know how that effer survived so much insulin. This was going to be a way to break this case open.
The trial of Nikki Capello finally begins on May 16th, 2022.
The story that we told the jury is that Nikki Capello had a plan. She set out to kill her husband and to get away with it. She's going to do it with insulin. And while he's sleeping, she gives him the jab. She tries it once and it doesn't work. About a week later, she doses him. He goes to sleep and does not wake up. She hides the body, and her plan is, if I can keep him here for 2 or 3 days, then I'll go dump him somewhere. But then it came to step 3 of her plan. She has trouble getting him down the stairs. She can't get him in the car. And she makes the weird decision to call somebody else. She'd have gotten away with it. If she had not told people, she'd have gotten away with it.
I saw Nikki face to face the whole trial. She never shed a tear. No emotion. It's almost like she wasn't human anymore.
On the final day of the trial, the jury returned after just 30 minutes of deliberation.
And they come out and they say, we, the people, in the case of State versus Nikki Capello, find the defendant guilty of the charge of murder.
Nikki Capello is given life with the possibility of parole.
It was bittersweet. Real justice comes when she rots in hell.
No sentence is long enough for what she did. No sentence. She is not a human. She is not a nurse.
The way I look at it is Nikki had to hate her daughter that much to go and take a mother away from her, a father away from her, everything.
I believe Jimmy is at rest.
Thumbs up. Fonzie.
But Riley is safe. She's so well loved.
We told her that your dad's in heaven with Jesus and he's helping the angels work on her car. Yeah, I miss that guy every day, yeah.
I would like to remember Jimmy how everyone remembered Jimmy. He made a knot in the community with his laughter and his sense of humor.
A good father, a great son, and a stand-up guy.
Oh, your egg?
The night of October 1st, 1993. In Petaluma began like any other ordinary night in a Northern California town, a kind of quiet that made one believe evil was somewhere far away. In another city, on another news report. In another person's life, a gentle breeze rustled through the trees in front of the houses. The cool autumn air cast a pleasant stillness over the low rooftops, and in the neighborhood where the Kloss family lived, the yellow lights from the windows onto the sidewalk looked so harmless that no one could have imagined that in just minutes, that place would become the focal point of one of the nightmares that would hold the breath of the entire United States. In the house at 112 West Street, 12-year-old Polly Kloss was doing what millions of children her age do on a weekend evening. Staying home with friends, laughing, talking about the little things of adolescence, living in the absolute sense of security that only childhood provides. No one in that room knew that there are nights without warning. There are moments when the line between safety and terror is as thin as a thread. And there are doors that, once opened, will never close the same way again. If you walked down that street that night, you would hear only the most ordinary sounds, the sound of a television from a nearby house, the slow rolling of tires on the pavement, the faint barking of a dog at the end of the street. Then silence, but behind that ordinary facade, fate was quietly approaching, without noise, without warning, without giving anyone a chance to prepare. That's what makes cases like this so haunting, not just because of the perpetrator's cruelty, but because it shatters a very fundamental human belief that home is the safest place. That when a child is in their bedroom, surrounded by friends, familiar objects, the scent of blankets, carpets, and wood in their own home, nothing can touch them. Polly Klaas grew up with that simple belief. She wasn't a name destined for investigation files, crime scene maps, or portraits on national television. She was a 12-year-old girl with a rich inner life, experiencing the very real confusions of adolescence, with nights like any other, and a future yet to unfold. But that night, that future was snatched from her hands in a few brief minutes, and it is that briefness that sends chills down one's spine. In a short period of time that many would later find unbelievable, a stranger entered the most private space of a family, imposing fear with a knife and taking a child into the darkness. Every crime has a first moment, a moment when everything changes direction. For the Klaas family, it wasn't gunshots, not shattering glass, not a prolonged chaos. It was a sudden, cold, and almost irrational intrusion, as if a nightmare had spontaneously taken human form in a dimly lit room. People usually think horror comes with screams, chaos, clear warning signs, but sometimes horror comes in a suffocating silence, in the stunned eyes of children who don't understand what's happening, in the way time suddenly shrinks and then stretches endlessly just because a stranger appears where he shouldn't be. And when the door closes behind him, what remains is not just fear. It was a void that was both real and unacceptable. A void that left parents breathless, a void that made the police understand that every passing minute now carried immense weight. A void that kept an entire community awake. Small towns often live on collective memory. People know each other, children go to school together. Families meet at the supermarket, on the soccer field, at school fundraising events. Therefore, when tragedy strikes a child, it never stays in one place. It spreads like a wave. It touches every kitchen, every dining table, every phone ringing in the middle of the night, every pair of parents standing silently by their child's bedside just to make sure the child is still there. The Polly Klaas case is not just the story of a kidnapper and a victim. It is the moment America looked into the darkness lurking within the most ordinary things. It is the moment people realized that even the smallest lapse in fate can change an entire community forever. The first few hours after a kidnapping are something anyone who has experienced a missing person understands all too well. The mind refuses to believe, but the body begins to tremble at the fact that the truth is right before its eyes. Phones are called. Polly's name is repeated. Hasty footsteps echo across the floor. Lights are turned on brighter. Adults try to keep their voices calm in front of the children, but their hands tremble uncontrollably. Questions rush in, futile in those first few minutes. Where is she? Who is he? How did he get here? How could this happen right here? It all begins. Petaluma in the early 1990s was the kind of town you could pass through once and carry that feeling of peace with you for a long time. As if it were built from the gentlest things in America, located in Sonoma County, north of San Francisco, Petaluma wasn't as noisy as the big cities. Nor was it so remote that it was completely isolated from modern life. It existed at a very special balance, where people still greeted each other on the street, still recognized their neighbor's familiar car, still remembered whose child had just started a new school, and still believed that terrible things only appeared on evening television. Not on their doorsteps. Mornings there often began with soft sunlight streaming down the small streets, the aroma of coffee wafting from kitchens onto porches, birds chirping in the trees, and the feeling that a new day could unfold in an orderly, predictable way. Without anything unusual, it was the kind of place families chose to raise their children. It's not because it's perfect, but because it's peaceful enough for adults to believe that childhood can be nurtured here without being swept away by life too soon. In the perception of many residents, Petaluma is a community. Not simply an administrative address, low-roofed houses, courtyards with wooden fences, small shops, local schools, weekend gatherings all connect to form a soft yet enduring structure. An invisible structure that makes people feel a sense of belonging during the day. Children ride their bikes through the streets, their shoes rustling softly on the sidewalks. In the afternoon, the sun sets behind the rooftops, casting a gentle golden hue over the lawns. In the evening, families close their doors, turn on the lights, eat dinner, watch TV, and talk about school, work, and the small things that make up life. Towns like Petaluma don't feel dramatic. They feel continuous, day after day followed by familiarity. This very familiarity made the subsequent tragedy even harder to accept, because it exploded right in the middle of a structure built on habit and belief. West Street, where the Kloss family lived, embodied this spirit. Nothing on that street suggested danger. There was no menace, no sign of chaos, no invisible tension that sometimes arises in unsafe places. The houses stood close enough together that each lit window gave the feeling of someone being nearby. In the evening, the golden light fell on the porches. The sound of passing cars was sparse, and if you stood there for a while, you could even hear the gentle rustling of palm leaves in the cool early autumn breeze. It was a space that parents trusted. A place where they let their children play, invited friends over for a night, and spent their early years within a circle of familiarity and relative safety. But to fully understand the gravity of this case, one needs to look beyond a single house and street. One needs to consider the context of America at that time. When the early 1990s were a period of both expanding mass media and growing anxiety about violent crime on television, Americans were accustomed to urgent news broadcasts, suspect portraits, scrolling text, and stories of kidnapping, assault, and murder that appeared so frequently that fear became an integral part of family life. Parents began hearing more safety advice about strangers, locks, and not letting children go alone. But hearing is one thing, truly believing that such horrors could happen in their own town is another. Most people rely on a self-reassurance mechanism. They read the bad news and tell themselves that their home is different. Their neighborhood is different. Their children are different. Their lives are different. Without that mechanism, perhaps no one could sleep peacefully. Petaluma also lived within that mechanism. A decent place, with family, school, and a stable rhythm of life, always made people feel like they were outside the danger zone. The Kloss family embodied the image of a family that neighbors could look at and find familiar. Polly lived with her mother, Eve Nickel, in a house on West Street. Her parents were divorced. But that breakdown didn't turn Polly's childhood into a cold void. On the contrary, those who loved her tried to keep her life as intact as possible, keeping her feeling that she was still seen, protected, and allowed to grow up as a normal child. In families where parents no longer live together, what children fear most is not just the separation, but the feeling that their world is being torn apart. But with Polly, the adults around her tried to keep those pieces from cutting into her childhood. Therefore, my mother's house is not just a place to live, it's a center of emotions. It's where I sleep, study, talk with friends, store my personal belongings, and build a 12-year-old girl's world with tiny things that only I consider important. The walls of a child's bedroom always hold more than we do. Before America knew Polly Kloss as a symbol of collective grief, before her portrait appeared on television screens, on missing person flyers, and in the anxious conversations of parents across the country, Polly was simply a 12-year-old girl teetering between childhood and adolescence, a fragile inflection so delicate that a closer look reveals both an unyielding innocence and the budding beginnings of an expanding inner world. She didn't enter life as a fated figure. She wasn't born to be the victim in a notorious murder case. She was a flesh and blood child, with unpredictable joys, petty anxieties, small pleasures, and adolescent emotions that came and went as quickly as sunlight through a window. And it was precisely because she lived in such an ordinary way that her later loss became so deeply suffocating. If anyone had met Polly before the fall of 1993, what they would remember about her probably wouldn't be anything dramatic, but rather the gentle feeling she left behind. Some children are remembered for their loudness, filling the room with laughter and incessant chatter. Polly didn't quite fit that description. There was something softer, quieter about her, as if she always carried a private space that not everyone could enter. It wasn't a cold, withdrawn attitude, but the characteristic sensitivity of children who perceive the world more intensely than they can express. Such children often observe longer than others realize, hearing subtle changes in adults' voices, sensing the atmosphere of a room even before anyone speaks, and holding on to those feelings in their own unique way. Polly seemed to be one such girl. She lived by her feelings just as much as by her words. Polly possesses a very real fragility, something that evokes both pity and a desire to protect in the eyes of adults. But Polly's fragility doesn't equate to weakness. At 12, she began to enter the strange realm of adolescence, where a child gradually learns to create their own identity. Mornings at school, conversations with friends, private thoughts written down or kept to themselves, lingering moments in the mirror, moments of sulking followed by forgiveness, all are signs of a person taking shape. This is what makes Polly's portrait so painful to look back on, because she wasn't just a child who had been wronged. She was a blossoming personality, a life finding its own rhythm. A person who should have had plenty of time to change, to grow, to love, to make mistakes, to mature, to become a version of herself that no one had yet fully seen. Family was the place that laid the foundation for Polly's first emotions, growing up in a family with divorced parents. She belonged to a type of childhood marked by subtle cracks, not always visible, but enough for a child to sense that the world isn't entirely certain. Many children raised in such circumstances learn to read adults' moods very early on. They know when to ask questions, when to remain silent, when a smile is genuine, and when it's just an adult trying to keep things stable. It's these kinds of experiences that often make them mature in some aspects before their time, while in others, they remain fully childlike. Polly seems to embody this blend. She still has the innocent needs of a 12-year-old girl she wants best friends, sleepovers, her own world, but at the same time, she possesses an emotional depth that reveals much more within her than is apparent. Perhaps that's why those who remember Polly remember not only her face, but also her aura. Something hard to name, but very clear, a little fragile, a little melancholic, a little dreamy, and beneath it all was a very human need for safety, for love, for being oneself in the small world of childhood. At Polly's age, a bedroom wasn't just a place to sleep, it was her first private territory, where a child learns to master a corner of their own world, where the most ordinary objects suddenly take on great meaning. A desk lamp, a stack of books, a few toys that have begun to be forgotten as their owner grows, a corner of the wall where they can stick something they like, a pillow, a drawer hiding private notes. Polly's room must have had that rhythm too. It was a space where she could close the door and temporarily detach herself from the adult world. They could sit with friends for hours, talking about things nobody else their age would consider important, then burst into laughter over a tiny detail. They could lie still, listening to the night fall and thinking about vague things they couldn't yet name. That's why, when referring to Polly as a victim, it's crucial not to let that image consume her true self. She once lived, she once had her own room, On the night of October 1st, 1993, nothing announced itself as history. There was no strange electricity in the air. No cinematic omen hanging over Petaluma. No warning carried in the wind as darkness settled over West Street. The neighborhood looked the way safe neighborhoods are supposed to look on a Friday night. Porch lights glowed in warm pools over steps and walkways. Curtains were drawn against the cooling autumn air. Television light flickered blue and silver behind windows. A car rolled past now and then, tires whispering over the pavement. Then the street would fall still again, inside the Kloss home. That stillness was the ordinary stillness of domestic life, the kind that forms when children feel protected enough to relax into themselves. Polly Kloss was 12 years old, and for her, this was not supposed to be a night that divided life into before and after. It was supposed to be a sleepover. One of those private, sparkling events that matter intensely when you are just old enough to feel your childhood changing, but still young enough to believe that fun can stretch late into the night without consequence. In Polly's bedroom, there were the soft signs of that age and that moment. Girls gathered close together, casual clutter. Voices rising and falling with the intimate rhythm of young friends who feel safe enough to be silly, serious, embarrassed, and excited all within the same hour. They talked the way girls that age talk when adults are elsewhere in the house and the room belongs to them. They moved through small currents of conversation, jokes, half-secrets, school life, the small dramas and private mythology of being 12. It was the kind of scene that parents allow because it feels harmless, because it is part of growing up, because it takes place under a roof that seems able to keep the rest of the world out. That illusion held until it didn't. At some point that night, a man came to the house. His approach was not grand or theatrical. He did not arrive like a monster from a nightmare. He arrived the way real predators often do, as a physical fact entering ordinary space. Richard Allen Davis, a career criminal with a long history behind him, moved toward the home, carrying with him the kind of violence that does not need noise to announce itself. He was not part of the family's world. He had no place in that neighborhood, no place near that house, and certainly no place inside the private sphere of a child's bedroom. Yet that is exactly where he went. The details of those minutes are haunting precisely because they were so abrupt. The night did not slowly darken into danger. Danger crossed the threshold all at once. Davis entered the home and made his way into Polly's room. One instant, there were 3 girls in a bedroom at a sleepover, surrounded by the familiar objects of childhood, by blankets and walls and the assumed safety of home. The next, there was a grown man standing there with a knife. That is how quickly innocence can be broken. The image remains so unbearable because it violated every instinctive boundary a child depends upon. A bedroom is supposed to be private. A sleepover is supposed to be joyful. A home is supposed to be the final line of protection. But in that room, under dim light and the stunned gaze of children who had no framework for what was happening, those protections collapsed in seconds. He ordered the girls to be quiet. He asserted control not with chaos, but with focused menace. The knife did not need to move much to dominate the room. It only had to exist in his hand. Paired with the authority of someone willing to do harm, fear changed the atmosphere instantly. Everything that had been soft became sharp. The room, moments earlier full of the emotional texture of young friendship, became a trap. The air itself must have seemed to tighten. For children, terror often arrives with confusion first. They know something is wrong before they can understand how wrong. They freeze because the mind resists a reality so unnatural. A stranger does not belong in the room. A man with a knife does not stand over a sleeping bag and give orders. A normal night does not transform like this. But it had, and the speed of it left almost no space between disbelief and obedience. Davis tied up Polly's 2 friends. The act was methodical and chilling. Not because it was complicated, but because it showed a cold awareness of what he needed to do to control the scene. Those girls were not just witnesses. They were children forced to watch helplessness become real. In many crimes, violence radiates outward from the direct victim. Here, even before Polly was taken from the house. The psychological destruction had already begun spreading through the room. Her friends were being taught, in the most brutal way imaginable, that there are moments when childhood offers no shield at all. Once the other girls were restrained, Davis turned his attention fully to Polly. She was wearing pajamas. She was inside the place where any child should have been safest. And now a stranger was forcing her to go with him into the night. There is something uniquely terrible about an abduction from within the home. A child taken from the street shocks the conscience. A child taken from her own bedroom tears through it. It tells every parent listening to the story that even the most familiar walls are not invulnerable. It tells every child that the place they trust most can be penetrated. Polly was made to leave with him. One can imagine the surreal horror of those steps. The floor beneath her feet was still the same floor she knew. The hallway was still her hallway. Somewhere else in the house, ordinary life still existed in fragments. Yet with each movement toward the door, the world she knew was receding. And she could not have known whether anyone would reach her in time. The deepest cruelty of those moments lies in how much they ask of a child all at once. To understand danger, to obey under threat. To move through fear while still hoping this will somehow stop. To cross the threshold of home not by choice, but under the command of a violent adult. Outside, the night that had seemed so calm now became an accomplice to concealment. Darkness absorbs detail. Streets that feel gentle in the evening can become blank and indifferent when someone is being taken against their will. Davis forced Polly into his car and drove away. The act itself was physically simple. A car door opening, a child placed inside, a vehicle pulling off into the dark, but morally, emotionally, and psychologically, that departure was catastrophic. In those seconds, Polly vanished from the protected coordinates of her life and entered the private control of a man whose intentions were predatory and whose capacity for violence had already been written across years of criminal conduct. Back inside the house, Polly's friends were left bound and terrified. Their ordeal did not end when the car disappeared. It had only changed form. Fear became waiting. Waiting became the unbearable labor of surviving the next minute. Children in crisis often feel time distort around them. A few moments can feel endless. The body may be frozen, but the mind races wildly. The room that had been their little island of privacy was now a crime scene before anyone had used that phrase. It held the afterimage of the intruder, the imprint of his threat. The space where Polly had been only minutes earlier, when the girls were finally able to raise the alarm. The night cracked open. The shift from private terror to public emergency is one of the defining rhythms of this case. One moment, the event belonged only to the children trapped inside it. The next, it belonged to a household in panic. Then to neighbors, then to law enforcement. Then eventually to the nation, but at the beginning, it was still intimate. It was still the sound of adults realizing, with a kind of collapsing disbelief, that a child had just been taken from inside the home. In many accounts of crime, the incident itself is treated as a clean sequence of actions. Yet what happened in the Kloss house that night was not clean in any human sense. It was messy with fear, disorientation, and the instant shattering of trust. There were no dramatic speeches, no neat lines of heroism, no reassuring pause in which someone understood exactly what to do. There was only the raw fact that Polly was gone and that every second now mattered. From that point on, the house could no longer remain merely a house. It had become the last known place where Polly was safe. Every object inside it took on a terrible new gravity. The bedroom was no longer only her room. It was the site of the invasion. The hallway was no longer only a passage between rooms. It was part of the route by which she had been forced out. Even the silence after the alarm must have felt changed, as if the air itself knew something had been removed that should have remained. The most devastating part of this incident is that it weaponized the ordinary. A Friday night, a child's bedroom, two friends sleeping over, a mother at home, a quiet neighborhood. None of these things are extraordinary. Together, they create the architecture of safety in which family life depends on being able to trust. Davis did not merely abduct Polly. He desecrated that architecture. He inserted terror into one of the most innocent domestic scenes imaginable and made it forever impossible to remember that night without seeing the before and after laid violently against each other. Before, there was laughter, privacy, and a child's easy assumption that tomorrow would come. After, there were restraints, panic, a missing girl, and a darkness so complete that no one in the house could yet measure it. It is important to remember that the incident was not only an act of physical kidnapping, it was also a psychological assault on everyone inside that home, and, soon, on an entire community. When word began to spread, Petaluma did not hear only that a child was missing. It heard that a child had been taken from her bedroom during a sleepover. Those details matter because they altered the emotional meaning of the crime. This was not random danger glimpsed from afar. This was danger stepping directly into the place where children are tucked in, where parents say goodnight, where friendship and innocence are supposed to be sheltered from the world. That is why the incident landed with such force. It struck at a foundational belief and shattered it in public, as investigators and family members began the desperate work that follows any abduction. The truth of the incident remained brutally simple. Richard Allen Davis had entered a home, terrorized children with a knife, tied up witnesses, taken Polly Klaas, and driven away into the night. Yet simplicity does not lessen horror. In some ways, it increases it. There was no labyrinthine plot, no elaborate conspiracy, no distant predator working through complicated means. There was only a violent man, a vulnerable child, and a few minutes in which the entire future changed. The tragedy of those minutes has echoed for decades because they are so easy to picture and so impossible to accept. Anyone can imagine the bedroom. Anyone can imagine the fear in the room when the stranger appeared. Anyone can imagine the car disappearing into darkness. And because anyone can imagine it, no one who hears this story can fully distance themselves from it. The incident remains unbearable, not only because of what happened to Polly, but because of how closely it brushes against the most ordinary hopes parents carry every night when they turn off the lights and assume morning will arrive intact. In retrospect, those few minutes have the compressed force of a detonation. They were brief, but they shattered lives far beyond their duration. For Polly, they marked the violent theft of agency, safety, and the future that should have unfolded in slow, ordinary chapters. For her mother, they marked the beginning of a nightmare no parent can truly prepare to survive. The instant when concern becomes panic, and panic becomes the lifelong ache of knowing the child you could protect. Yesterday is beyond your reach tonight, for the two girls in the room. Those minutes became a permanent fracture inside memory. Childhood divides itself strangely after trauma. There is the self before witnessing evil and the self after, even if the body remains small. Something heavy enters the mind and never completely leaves. That is part of the incident, too. Not only what the abductor did, but what he forced others to carry. And for Petaluma, the abduction became the moment innocence stopped feeling like a reliable civic condition and started looking instead like a fragile arrangement that could be destroyed at any hour. The incident also contains the cruelest kind of contrast. While terror was unfolding in one room, the rest of the world kept behaving normally, somewhere nearby. Dishes were being washed, televisions were humming. Someone was locking a shop, someone else was laughing at a joke. Someone was probably glancing at the clock and thinking only of bedtime. That is the obscenity of violent crime. It can tear a hole through one house while the rest of the night remains outwardly unchanged. The stars do not move differently. The street does not cry out. The neighborhood, for a few more moments, keeps its peaceful face. Then the news spreads, and the peaceful face is gone. By the time the first frantic explanations were being given, by the time people began repeating the impossible facts out loud in order to make them real, the essential damage had already been done. Polly had been removed from the center of her own life and taken into the control of a man with no mercy in him. The sleepover had ended, not with drowsy whispers and morning light, but with terror, restraint, and absence. That absence is the final note of the incident. And perhaps the most devastating, a child who should have remained in her room was no longer there. Her place in the house had become an outline, her name, spoken now in urgency, had already changed from something familiar into a plea. And in the stunned silence after the first rush of movement, after the first desperate calls, the house itself seemed to hold its breath, as if every wall, every doorway, every ordinary object had become witness to the instant one child was pulled out of safety forever, that night there. When the first shock inside the Kloss home began to take on words, the house itself seemed to change shape. Only minutes earlier, it had been a family home on a quiet street, filled with the harmless clutter and soft disorder of an ordinary Friday night. Now every room carried a different weight. The air felt thinner. The walls, which had offered the illusion of privacy and protection, suddenly seemed permeable, exposed, as if violence had passed through them and left behind a pressure that could still be felt in the bedroom where the sleepover had turned into a scene of terror. The change was most immediate. Nothing in the room had moved far from its place in the grand sense. The furniture was still there. The blankets were still there. The familiar objects of a young girl's life remained where they had been only moments before, yet the room was no longer innocent. It had become a chamber of interruption, the last enclosed space where Polly Kloss had existed inside the safety of her own world before that world was violently opened and emptied. The discovery began not with forensic procedure, but with panic. Polly's friends, left bound and terrified after Richard Allen Davis forced Polly from the room, were the first living evidence of what had happened. Their fear was not abstract. It clung to the room. It trembled in their voices. In the details they struggled to say, in the stunned, half-broken rhythm with which children recount a nightmare that arrived too fast to understand. They had not witnessed a confusing accident or a household emergency. They had seen a stranger with a knife enter a place that was supposed to be safe, take control of the room in seconds, and leave with their friend. That kind of terror imprints itself instantly. Even before investigators entered the house, the emotional truth of the crime was already visible in the condition of the girls who remained behind. They were shaken, frightened, and forced into an adulthood of memory they had not chosen, because from that night forward, no sleepover, no dark room, no creak in a hallway would ever be purely ordinary again. Adults in the house moved with the frantic energy of people trying to outrun reality. The first calls for help were not calm. They came from the raw place where disbelief and urgency overlap. A child has been taken. A man was here. He had a knife. He tied up the girls. He took Polly. Those sentences, once spoken aloud, must have sounded impossible even to the people saying them. They had the crude, blunt force of truths that the mind rejects while the body is already reacting to them. Telephones were grabbed, doors were opened, lights were switched on. The house that had been darkening into nighttime domestic quiet was abruptly flooded with motion and fear. The emotional center of the scene was absence. Polly should have been there. Her voice should have been in the room, her body on the floor or the bed among her friends. Her belongings still attached to a life unfolding in the normal sequence of childhood. Instead, there was a gap where she had been, and that gap seemed larger than the room itself. When law enforcement arrived, the first challenge was the same challenge that haunts every abduction in its earliest minutes, understanding how much of the event could still be recovered from the place where it began. Time in those moments does not behave normally. It becomes both urgent and slippery. Officers and investigators entering the Kloss house had to absorb the human reality first. This was not a theoretical crime scene. This was an active emergency. A 12-year-old girl had been taken from her bedroom by a stranger at knife point. The house still held frightened children. The adults were trying to make sense of impossible facts. Every question asked in those first minutes carried immense pressure because every answer might point toward a direction, a vehicle, a route, a face, or some tiny detail still warm enough to lead to Polly before the trail went cold. The room itself began giving up its first clues in silence. Restraints used on the girls became immediate evidence not only of the intruder's presence, but of his method. He had entered with enough control and predatory calm to neutralize witnesses before removing Polly. That detail mattered. It suggested planning within the moment, a cold ability to dominate children, and a willingness to use intimidation efficiently. The knife described by the girls was not just a weapon. It was an extension of his authority over the room, their accounts of his movements, his commands, his appearance. And the sequence of events became the first map investigators had of the intruder. But children under extreme stress do not give testimony in neat chronological packages. Memory comes out in flashes, fragments, sensory impressions, a face glimpsed under low light, the shape of a silhouette, the sound of a voice, the roughness of a command, the terrible ordinariness of footsteps crossing a bedroom floor. The emotional burden on those first interviews cannot be overstated. Investigators had to extract usable information from traumatized children without crushing them further. Had to separate what was seen from what was felt, had to ask the same questions in slightly different ways, because detail matters in an abduction, and children often remember one piece only after another has been spoken aloud. What did he look like? How tall did he seem? What was he wearing? Did he say anything distinctive? Did he smell of anything? Which direction did he go? Did you hear a car? Did Polly say anything? Each answer mattered. Each incomplete answer was its own kind of agony. Somewhere outside that house, the man they were trying to describe was moving farther away, and the child they were trying to save was with him. As the scene was processed, the most chilling aspect of the room was how normal so much of it still looked. That is often the cruelty of indoor crime scenes involving children. Trauma does not automatically rearrange furniture into cinematic disorder. It often leaves behind a setting that still resembles life a few minutes earlier. And it is precisely that resemblance that feels unbearable. There may have been sleeping bags, clothing, the residue of a sleepover evening, ordinary objects belonging to girls on the edge of adolescence. Those details were not trivial. They sharpened the obscenity of the crime. Polly had not been taken from danger. She had been taken from ordinary life in mid-breath. Every familiar item in that room now acted like a witness to contrast. Childhood remained in the object. Terror remained in the atmosphere. The crime scene was the collision point of the two, outside. The neighborhood began to wake to the fact that something was terribly wrong. A police presence on a quiet residential street changes more than traffic patterns. It changes the emotional weather. Porch lights that usually mean comfort begin to look exposed. Neighbors step outside in robes or jackets, drawn by the motion of vehicles, by voices pitched too high, by the hard-to-mistake frequency of official urgency. In cases like this, community awareness forms almost immediately. But at first it is hazy, half-informed, and full of dread. A girl is missing. Taken from the house during a sleepover. A knife was involved, even before the full facts were confirmed. The shape of the horror spread outward. People could already understand enough to be afraid. Inside the Kloss home, investigators had to preserve what the scene could still yield. Doors, windows, pathways through the house, possible entry and exit points, and the general condition of the home all became critical. Did the intruder force entry? Or was some access point unsecured? What route did he take inside? How quickly had he reached Polly's room? Had he been watching the house beforehand? Or had he moved opportunistically? These were not abstract criminal profiling questions yet. They were immediate operational concerns. Every indication of how he entered and moved could help define what kind of offender they were dealing with. An intruder who stumbles into a room in panic is one kind of threat. An intruder who navigates a house dominates children, and leaves with one victim is another entirely. The earliest physical evidence in such cases often feels frustratingly modest compared with the scale of the crime. There is rarely a dramatic single object that explains everything. Instead, there are traces, impressions, absences, tiny confirmations that a violent event really did unfold where people wish it had not. Fibers may matter, fingerprints may matter, footwear impressions may matter, the arrangement of objects may matter, the timing of calls matters, the consistency of witness accounts matters. At the house on West Street, all of that began with a single, crushing reality. The crime scene could tell investigators how Polly had been taken, but not yet where she had gone, and that gap between what the scene could reveal and what everyone most needed to know became the emotional engine of the first hours. Search efforts widened rapidly because abduction cases live or die on momentum. Patrol units, local officers, detectives, and soon many others began operating under the terrible arithmetic of lost time. Roads had to be considered. Vehicles had to be imagined. Nearby areas had to be checked. Yet every outward movement depended, in part, on what was learned from the house. The house was origin. It was the point from which every possible route radiated. Even the simplest details from the girls' accounts might change the geometry of the search. If a car engine was heard immediately, that suggested one timeline. If footsteps lingered first, another. If the suspect's voice suggested age, region, intoxication, or agitation, those impressions could influence how officers thought about him in the field. In the first stage of investigation, no detail is too small because small details sometimes become the hinge between chaos and direction. There was also the unbearable symbolic meaning of the scene. A child's bedroom occupied by investigators under bright lights is one of the most heartbreaking images a community can encounter. It means innocence has been translated into evidence. It means the private space where a young life unfolded has been surrendered, however temporarily, to documentation, measurement, questioning, and procedural necessity. Every adult present would have understood that irony in some form. The room still belonged emotionally to Polly, but practically it now belonged to the search for her. The hope embedded in that transformation was urgent and fragile. If the room had been the place she was taken from, perhaps it could also become the place that gave enough back to bring her home. As the first official understanding of the abduction sharpened, the scene revealed something else about the offender. He was bold. He was controlled enough to enter an occupied home. He was willing to confront multiple children. He accepted witnesses. He used threat effectively and moved quickly enough to leave before intervention stopped him. Those characteristics were alarming because they suggested not merely desperation, but experience, confidence, and a predatory willingness to impose fear face to face. Investigators in the earliest hours of a case often begin constructing not only a factual timeline, but an emotional profile of the intruder's conduct. How comfortable was he in the environment? How much risk did he tolerate? Did he appear frantic or deliberate? In the Kloss house, the answer emerging from the scene was chilling. This was not a hesitant trespasser. This was a man who had crossed into intimate domestic space and acted with terrifying decisiveness. The first night bled into the first long stretch of official search, but the house remained fixed in memory as the place where everything split open. Even after officers left and re-entered, after more lights swept across walls and floors, after evidence technicians and detectives worked through the logic of intrusion and abduction, the essential wound remained visible in one fact. Polly's life was still present in the room, but Polly was not. That contrast is the deepest clue any abduction scene can offer and the cruelest one. It tells investigators that the victim was real, recent, close, and violently removed. It tells the family that home did not hold. It tells the community that safety failed within arm's reach. By dawn, the discovery phase of the case had done what it always must, and never enough. It had transformed terror into a documented event. It had collected the first accounts, the first observations, the first material signs that might point toward the offender. It had defined the site of entry, the room of confrontation, the witnesses left behind, and the fact of forced departure into the night. But it had not yet answered the only question that truly mattered. Where was Polly? That question hovered over every photograph taken in the room, every note written by an investigator, every repetition of the girl's memories, every patrol car moving through Petaluma's dark streets. The discovery had been immediate, terrible, and clarifying in one sense. A stranger had entered. A child had been taken. The room bore witness. The house bore witness. The surviving girls bore witness, yet the scene's greatest revelation was also its greatest torment. It showed with devastating precision the moment safety ended, while remaining silent about where the darkness had carried her after. In the hours immediately following the abduction, even the sounds around the house took on evidentiary weight. A car door remembered by one child, the possibility of tires moving off, the uncertain interval between the intruder leaving the room and the alarm being raised. All of it became part of the fragile architecture of the timeline. Detectives know that the first version of time in a trauma case is rarely precise, yet they also know it cannot be ignored. A minute can become a mile. 2 minutes can mean a suspect caught at a traffic light or already beyond the edge of the county. So clocks were checked, calls logged, recollections aligned as carefully as possible against the sequence of response. The effort was clinical, but the emotional undertow was relentless. Every reconstruction of the offender's departure was also a reconstruction of Polly being carried farther from help. That is what made the initial clue work so harrowing. It was not merely technical labor. It was an attempt to reverse darkness using memory, pressure, and whatever the scene had not yet forgotten, and hanging over all of it was the knowledge that crime scenes involving children are often cruelly asymmetrical. The place where the victim was last seen can become rich with detail about violation, entry, control, and fear, yet remain agonizingly poor in what everyone most longs to know, whether the child is cold, hurt, crying, still alive, still within reach. Silence there became another kind of evidence. By the time the search for Polly Klaas moved from the first frantic hours into the grinding machinery of a major investigation, Petaluma had stopped feeling like a town and started feeling like the inside of a held breath. Streets were still there. Houses were still there. Front lawns still carried the same pale morning light. But everything seemed to exist under strain, as if the entire community had been pulled tight around one terrible question and could not loosen until it was answered. The case had already become more than a local emergency. It was now a race against time conducted under the gaze of an increasingly horrified public. And with every hour that passed, the investigation had to do something almost impossible. Move fast without becoming reckless, widen without becoming diffuse, and stay human while confronting the possibility that a child had vanished into the hands of a practiced predator. In the early days, law enforcement was inundated with the raw material that always follows a child abduction and almost never arrives in a clean, useful form. Tips flooded in. Some came from people who truly believed they had seen something. Some came from neighbors who had heard a noise, noticed a car, remembered a stranger in the area days earlier. Some came from the national attention now pouring onto the case. From voices outside Petaluma attaching themselves to the story with half memory and fear. Detectives had to listen to all of it because any one of those fragments, however unlikely, might conceal the thing that mattered. Yet most did not. Most were noise. And that is one of the great hidden agonies of a major investigation. The public experiences urgency as a demand for movement. But investigators often experience urgency as the burden of sorting truth from a mountain of panic, misperception, coincidence, and desperation. Inside command centers and interview rooms, maps began to fill with marks and routes and names. Timelines were redrawn and adjusted. The route from the Klaas home out into the wider roads of the county had to be imagined from the point of view of a fleeing offender. Officers considered what kind of man would commit a crime like this. Was he local? Was he passing through? Had he targeted Polly specifically or selected the house opportunistically? Had he watched the home in advance? Had he broken in elsewhere before? The most dangerous thing about such questions is that they are necessary long before they can be answered. Investigators cannot afford to wait for certainty before they begin constructing the probable shape of a suspect. But the probable shape of a suspect is not the suspect himself, and every assumption carries the risk of closing doors that should remain open. In those first stages, the investigation had to become a machine for holding multiple possibilities at once. That meant checking sex offenders, parolees, violent burglars, drifters, prowlers, men with histories of kidnapping or knife crimes. Anyone in driving distance whose past suggested the ability to do what had been done. The case drew in local police, county investigators, federal attention, volunteers, and a swelling ecosystem of search efforts and information processing. The search for Polly happened in public, but the investigation unfolded in a more private rhythm. One marked by fluorescent lights, stale coffee, ringing phones, interview transcripts, and the slow corrosion of certainty. Detectives interviewed neighbors again and again, pressing gently and then more firmly at the edges of memory. Did you hear an engine? Did you notice a vehicle that did not belong? Was there anyone on foot in the area? Had anyone been seen watching houses? Memory under fear is slippery. It can produce one luminous detail and erase 10 others. It can also be contaminated by repetition, by news reports, by other people's stories. So investigators had to separate what was actually observed from what had been adopted afterward. That process is patient and exhausting even when the case is not carrying the weight of national scrutiny. Here, every hour sharpened the pain. The public wanted progress. The family needed answers. The little girls in Polly's room had already given detectives one of the most important early tools, a description of the intruder. But description alone does not hand over a name. It gives shape without identity. It tells you what fear looked like when it stood in a child's doorway. It does not tell you where it sleeps or what aliases it uses or how many times it has escaped the system before. Sketches and suspect comparisons therefore became part of the rhythm of the case. Men were looked at, questioned, ruled in, ruled out. Some looked close enough to ignite dread, then fell apart under timeline checks or physical differences. Others had criminal records ugly enough to command attention, but no link to Petaluma that night. Every time detectives leaned toward a possibility, hope rose in the people following the case. Every time that possibility collapsed, the investigation seemed to sink under its own exhaustion for a moment before pushing forward again. False leads are not just administrative obstacles. In a child abduction, they wound everyone touched by the case. Families braced themselves. Investigators reorganize resources. Media narratives lurch toward a new center. Volunteers repeat names and rumors, and then suddenly the thing dissolves into nothing. The energy spent on it cannot be recovered. It becomes part of the cumulative fatigue of the search. And this case produced fatigue quickly because it demanded total effort from people while giving back maddeningly little. There were search teams in fields, roadsides, and rural areas. There were helicopters, patrol routes, canvases, records checks, calls to other jurisdictions, analysis of similar offenders and crimes, posters bearing Polly's face spread outward. Her image traveled farther than she could, entering gas stations, storefronts, television screens, conversations between strangers. In a cruel inversion, the victim became easier and easier for the world to picture while remaining impossible for investigators to physically locate. As days passed, one of the ugliest possibilities grew heavier in every room where the case was being discussed. Detectives know, even when they do not say it aloud in front of families, that the window for recovering an abducted child alive can be brutally narrow. That knowledge affects the tone of an investigation long before it appears in public statements. It makes every dead end feel less like delay and more like damage. One tip suggested a direction, then evaporated. Another implied the offender might have had a particular vehicle, then failed under scrutiny. Names surfaced from criminal databases, from parole rosters, from old arrest patterns, from people the community already distrusted. And one by one, many of them led nowhere. Meanwhile, the national profile of the case was expanding. Publicity can help. It can shake loose a witness, produce a memory, expose a face. It can also complicate everything. People begin to see the case everywhere. They attach ordinary men to extraordinary evil on instinct. They call in sightings shaped by anxiety. The investigation becomes not only a hunt for an offender, but a defense against narrative chaos. Through all of it, the detectives had to remain anchored in the ugly discipline of evidence. They could not arrest the man who seemed most monstrous in the imagination. They needed the man whose movements, history, and physical reality converged with what had happened inside the Kloss home. Richard Allen Davis existed inside that widening universe of possibility long before he was decisively fixed at its center. He was exactly the kind of offender investigators had reason to fear. A violent repeat criminal, transient in behavior, predatory, accustomed to slipping in and out of the margins where institutions lose track of dangerous men. But dangerous men are plentiful in criminal files. The challenge is not knowing that someone like Davis exists. The challenge is finding the exact line that connects his existence to one house, on one street, on one night, for a time. That line remained obscured. The case moved through the dark terrain of suspects without answers. Some men were examined because they lived nearby, some because their criminal history aligned too well with the psychology of the offense. Some because they resembled the description enough to demand attention. Investigators chased the possibility of local prowlers. They considered whether the abduction had some hidden personal motive. They explored the terrifying question of whether Polly might have been targeted in advance. They weighed whether this was a burglar whose crime escalated suddenly or a man who entered already intending to take a child. Each theory cast a different light on the offender. Each theory redirected attention. Each also risked becoming a trap if investigators fell in love with it before the evidence deserved that loyalty. The media environment turned every uncertainty into pressure. Cameras do not like ambiguity. Audiences do not tolerate it well either. Yet ambiguity is the native climate of active investigations. Detectives had to answer questions without revealing everything. They had to protect witness accounts, preserve strategic information, and keep the offender from learning too much about what law enforcement knew, all while appearing not to be lost, but in truth. For stretches of this case, they were lost in the only honest sense that matters. They did not yet know who had Polly, and they did not know where she was. That is the condition people outside investigations often underestimate. A major case can look active from the outside and still feel terrifyingly blind from within. Officers can be working without rest. Hundreds of leads can be processed. And yet the center can remain empty. That emptiness is what defines the dead-end phase. It is not inactivity. It is effort without closure. The longer that phase lasted, the more the case became a test of endurance. Detectives had to revisit names they had already set aside. They had to question whether early assumptions had misled them. They had to cross-check old information against new reports. They had to think geographically, psychologically, and procedurally all at once. Rural locations around Sonoma County and beyond took on a haunted quality because any isolated turnoff, any patch of brush, any roadside embankment could feel like a place where the case might end in the worst possible way. Searchers moved through landscapes that seemed innocent in daylight and full of dread in the imagination. Every ditch, every clearing, every overlooked area became a possible answer nobody wanted for Polly's family and for the public. Time was becoming a second antagonist. Every news cycle without resolution widened the emotional crater of the case. Her father, Mark Kloss, became a visible and anguished presence, speaking publicly pleading, hoping, refusing surrender in front of cameras because to stop speaking would have felt too much like accepting silence. That public grief fed the urgency around the case. But it also intensified the stakes of every investigative move. A wrong suspect would not simply be a mistaken line of inquiry. It would be a fresh wound inflicted on a family already living inside one. There were also the private psychological dead ends. The moments when investigators must have stared at walls covered in notes and felt the structure of the case refusing to yield. An offender had entered a home, terrorized children, abducted a girl, and disappeared. He was dangerous enough to act boldly and competent enough, at least for a while, to stay ahead of a massive response. That combination is demoralizing because it suggests a man who does not collapse quickly under pressure. Cases like this begin to generate a grim respect for the offender's ability to remain hidden. And detectives have to resist letting that respect become fatalism. Somewhere in all the records, all the roads, all the overlapping criminal histories, all the tips and sightings and contradictions, there had to be a pathway to the truth. But until that pathway appeared, the investigation remained trapped in motion without resolution. Dead ends also have a social life of their own. In communities under strain, rumor starts colonizing the empty spaces evidence cannot yet fill. People begin identifying suspicious strangers in hindsight. Unrelated crimes acquire new significance. Men who fit the broad silhouette of danger become objects of whispered scrutiny. Parents watch schoolyards differently. Children absorb more than adults think. Petaluma's fear was no longer contained within the Klaas home. It had become atmospheric. The case taught the town to imagine threat in places where it had once imagined only routine. That is what unsolved days do to a community. They rearrange instinct, and still the investigation kept grinding. Detectives worked the offender pool, reworked witness statements, coordinated across agencies, and tried to identify the point at which the abstract suspect would become a person with a traceable route. A documentable history, a car, a behavior pattern, a mistake. Because major offenders are often caught not only by brilliance on the part of investigators, but by friction. A parole violation, a traffic stop, a loose statement, a witness who remembers one detail too late, a physical item left behind, a pattern that only becomes visible after enough data has been endured. In the dead-end phase, investigators have to believe that friction will happen or has happened already without their knowing it. They have to keep working as if the case is solvable before it feels solvable. That discipline is one of the least visible forms of courage in criminal investigation. It is easier, in a case this awful, to be consumed by the absence than to continue interrogating it. Yet that is exactly what they did. The search for suspects did not produce a quick villain presented neatly to the public. It produced instead a landscape of dangerous possibilities. Each one examined and many discarded, a long corridor of maybe after maybe after maybe. And at the end of each maybe, until the breakthrough came. There was the same crushing void. Polly was still missing. Her room had been the beginning. The investigation had become vast. The world was watching, but for a terrible stretch. The truth remained just beyond reach, and that distance between effort and answer was where the case lived. Where detectives lost sleep, where hope wore thin without quite dying. And where the entire machinery of justice was forced to keep moving through darkness with nothing to hold on to except the belief that somewhere ahead, one of these roads would finally stop lying. The breakthrough in the Polly Klaas case did not arrive like a triumphant revelation descending cleanly from the heavens. It came the way breakthroughs in terrible cases so often do. Through a convergence of pressure, chance, persistence, and the offender's own inability to move through the world without leaving behind some trace of himself. By the time investigators began to close in on Richard Allen Davis, the case had already passed through the cruel middle stage that drains everyone involved. The frantic urgency of the first hours had hardened into exhaustion. The flood of tips had generated as much confusion as clarity. The public had learned Polly's face by heart. Her family had been forced to live minute by minute inside a form of hope that hurts. Detectives were still working, still asking, still checking, still refusing to let the case go dark. But they were doing it under the weight of time and the growing fear that if the truth did not surface soon, it would surface in the worst possible form. Then, out of the churn of a massive investigation, the shape of the offender began to sharpen. One of the decisive turns came through the kind of contact that seems almost offensively mundane when set beside the horror of a child abduction. Davis came to the attention of law enforcement after a burglary-related encounter in the days following Polly's disappearance, in another life. In another week, it might have been treated as one more piece of routine criminal behavior in a man already saturated with crime. But major cases often pivot on exactly these moments, when an offender who believes himself invisible brushes against ordinary police process and leaves enough of himself behind for investigators to begin pulling the thread. Davis, like many repeat offenders, carried a history that made him dangerous not only because of what he had done, but because of how long he had been able to keep doing variations of it. He had drifted through the criminal justice system with the accumulated record of a man who had taught himself that rules were temporary and consequences negotiable. Men like that often believe, with some reason, that the world is too disorganized to hold them for long. They rely on institutional fatigue. They rely on bureaucratic gaps. They rely on the fact that each prior offense gets filed away as a separate injury rather than assembled into the portrait of a human threat. But sometimes the portrait begins to assemble anyway. As investigators circled around the developing lead, the case against Davis did not emerge all at once. It gathered mass information from his conduct, his history, his movements, and the broadening understanding of the timeline started to align in a way that no longer felt like coincidence. Detectives had been moving for days through a fog of possibilities. Suspect after suspect, theory after theory. And what made this moment different was not a sudden burst of certainty, but the eerie feeling that disparate pieces were beginning to point in the same direction. That feeling matters in major investigations. Experienced detectives are cautious with intuition, because intuition unmoored from evidence can wreck a case. But there is a point in some investigations when the evidence itself begins to generate its own gravity. Names that once floated among many others start sinking to the bottom and staying there. Questions that once opened outward begin closing around one man. Davis was becoming that man. The most crucial physical link came through evidence found inside his car. A hair consistent with Polly's was recovered from the interior. In the architecture of criminal cases, this kind of evidence can change everything. Until then, detectives may suspect, infer, and narrow. But suspicion remains vulnerable. It can be challenged, redirected, weakened by ambiguity. Physical evidence is different. It creates contact. It says that the victim and the suspect did not merely exist in the same broad world of possibility, but occupied the same enclosed space. For the investigators who had spent days trying to cross the abyss between the Kloss bedroom and the unknown, the significance of that hair must have landed with the force of both relief and dread. Relief, because at last the case had a real line leading somewhere concrete. Dread, because the line led into the car of a violent repeat offender. And everyone understood what that likely meant for Polly. Even then, the breakthrough was not a single instant. It expanded through interrogation, corroboration, and the gradual collapse of the offender's distance from the crime. Davis did what many guilty men do when pressure tightens around them. He shifted, deflected, tested the boundaries of what investigators knew, and revealed in pieces what he had hoped to control. Interrogations in such cases are less like the dramatic confessions of fiction than like a slow grinding process of pressure and exposure. Detectives confront a suspect with facts. Watch where he retreats, where he lies, where he becomes vague, where he over-explains, where his confidence falters. They try to identify the seam in the performance. With a man like Davis, whose life had already trained him in predation and denial, that process would have required not only patience, but emotional discipline. They were not speaking to a confused witness or a minor accomplice. They were speaking to the man who had entered a child's bedroom, controlled a room full of girls with a knife, and taken Polly into the night. Every question carried rage under it. Every professional instinct had to restrain that rage and convert it into method. As evidence accumulated, Davis's connection to the case grew harder to deny. The investigation that had spent days moving through uncertainty now had a center. That center was not merciful. A breakthrough in a child abduction case is often emotionally double-edged. The same moment that brings clarity can also extinguish the last plausible forms of hope. Investigators may tell themselves not to conclude too much, too soon, but human beings are not made of procedural language. Once Polly's presence in Davis's vehicle became part of the case, the emotional weather changed. The question was no longer simply who took her, it was what had already happened to her, and how much of it could still be recovered, explained, or avenged. Davis eventually led investigators to Polly's body in a rural area. This is the part of the breakthrough that transforms it from investigative success into tragedy fully realized. Up to that point, no matter how grim the probabilities, hope still exists as an act of defiance. Families cling to it. Communities cling to it. Even investigators, hard-earned as their realism may be, carry some protected inner chamber where the victim is still alive until the proof arrives otherwise. When Davis revealed where Polly had been left, that chamber collapsed. The search that had mobilized thousands and held an entire nation in suspense reached the answer everyone feared and nobody wanted spoken aloud. The landscape where Polly was found was far from the warmth of her bedroom, far from the domestic lights of West Street, far from the world of sleepover talk and adolescent softness in which she had last been seen. That geographical distance magnified the moral violence of the crime. Davis had not only taken Polly from home, he had carried her out beyond the boundaries of ordinary life and left her in a place of isolation, as if attempting to erase her from the human map, but discovery resists erasure. Even in the bleakest sense, the breakthrough restored one thing the crime had tried to destroy completely. Truth. The truth was terrible. But it was no longer abstract. It had a location. It had a perpetrator. It had evidence strong enough to anchor the case in reality rather than rumor, fear, and endless conjecture. For detectives, this stage of the case would have been marked by a strange and brutal mixture of satisfaction and grief. There is no joy in solving a case like this when the victim is dead. There is only the grim knowledge that uncertainty has ended and that the system can now move toward accountability. The breakthrough, therefore, did not feel like victory. It felt like a door opening into the full size of the loss. Yet breakthroughs matter precisely because without them, the dead are stranded inside questions. Polly's case was no longer stranded. Davis's role was no longer one suspect possibility among many. He was the offender, and the path from this bedroom to the body could now be reconstructed with horrifying specificity. The nation, which had followed the disappearance with mounting alarm, now had to absorb the outcome. Public grief deepened into something heavier and more permanent. Search posters that had carried hope now seemed almost unbearable to look at. The bright, vulnerable face that had called strangers into action was no longer the face of a child who might still be found alive. It became the face of a child failed by one man's violence and by a system that had allowed that man to remain free long enough to reach her. This is one reason the breakthrough in the Kloss case resonated so powerfully beyond the immediate criminal facts. It did not merely identify a killer. It exposed a wider institutional shame. Richard Allen Davis had not appeared from nowhere. He came trailing convictions, parole history, violent behavior, and all the signs of a man who had been repeatedly given chances he had never earned. Once the case turned decisively toward him, the public could see not only an individual monster but the bureaucratic negligence that had helped create the conditions for his access to Polly. The breakthrough therefore illuminated both the crime and the failures behind it. In investigative terms, the case also demonstrated how major resolutions are often built from layers rather than miracles. Witness accounts from the bedroom mattered. The preservation of the crime scene mattered. The relentless processing of leads mattered. The seemingly routine contact with Davis after the abduction mattered. The forensic evidence from the car mattered. The interrogation mattered, no single layer. By itself, would have carried the full weight. Together, they became a structure strong enough to hold the truth. That is important, because people sometimes imagine breakthroughs as flashes of genius. More often, they are the earned result of refusing to stop assembling fragments until the fragments begin speaking the same language. By the time Davis led authorities to Polly, the investigation had become that kind of structure. It had absorbed confusion, false leads, public pressure, and emotional devastation without disintegrating. It had narrowed from a field of fear into a prosecutable reality. And yet, for everyone who loved Polly, the cost of that reality was unbearable. There is a unique cruelty in the moment a family learns that hope must change its form. It cannot remain the hope of rescue. It becomes the hope of truth, of justice, of preventing another child from meeting the same fate, of making the offender's name synonymous with punishment rather than power. Mark Kloss would channel that transformation publicly and forcefully. But in the immediate wake of the breakthrough, the family was still first and foremost a family hearing the worst confirmation imaginable. The investigative breakthrough, so necessary in legal and moral terms, arrived wrapped around a parental nightmare. It answered the question of who with enough force to answer the question of what. And once both answers stood together, no one could look away from the sheer brutality of the case. What had once been an emergency search was now a homicide case with a living perpetrator and a dead child. That shift also altered the emotional role of law enforcement. Until then, officers and detectives had been hunting with the rescuing impulse still somewhere in the center of the mission. After the recovery of Polly's body, the mission hardened. It became not less urgent, but differently urgent. The task was no longer to save Polly. It was to build a case so complete that Davis could never narrate his way out of it, manipulate doubt around it, or exploit procedural weakness to escape its consequences. In that sense, the breakthrough was the hinge between two moral responsibilities. First, find the child. Then, once that hope was taken away, speak for her with evidence stronger than the offender's lies. Looking back, the breakthrough of the Polly Kloss case remains haunting because it is both exactly what everyone prayed for and the destruction of those prayers. People wanted the case to break. They needed the darkness to have a face. They needed all the drifting suspicion and pain to cohere around the truth. But when the truth came, it arrived carrying death. That is the unbearable paradox of many true crime resolutions. Clarity is not comfort. Sometimes clarity is simply the end of pretending that comfort is still possible. Even so, the breakthrough mattered beyond measure. It restored narrative authority to the facts. It ended the reign of speculation. It gave the family and the public a perpetrator they could name, confront, and eventually watch prosecuted. It exposed the chain of institutional decisions that had allowed a dangerous man to remain loose in the world, and it ensured that Polly Kloss would not vanish into the category of the never found. The forever unsolved, the child whose face fades while the offender continues walking unseen. Davis had tried to turn the case into disappearance. The breakthrough turned it back into witness, evidence, and truth. That is why, even in grief, it stands as the decisive moral pivot of the story. The road from Petaluma's quiet street to that moment had passed through terror, dead ends, rumors, exhaustive police work, and the raw endurance of a family forced to live under national attention. But once the investigation closed its hand around Davis, the darkness was no longer shapeless. It had a name, a history, a vehicle, a trail, and a body of evidence attached to it. From that point forward, the question was no longer whether the system could identify the man responsible. It was whether the system, having finally seen him clearly, would prove capable of doing what it had failed to do so many times before. Keep him from ever touching another human life again. And in that turn of the investigation, there was one more bitter truth revealed. Breakthroughs do not resurrect the child. but they do strip power from the man who believed he could reduce her to silence. Davis had forced Polly into darkness, believing, as predators often do, that fear and distance would protect him. Instead, step by step, evidence walked back toward him. The room he invaded spoke through witnesses. The car he used betrayed him. The body he abandoned became testimony. The system that had failed to stop him earlier had, at last, caught up. Too late for innocence. Too late for rescue, but not too late for judgment. When the Polly Klaas case moved into the courtroom, the center of gravity shifted again. For months, the story had lived in bedrooms, police briefings, roadside searches, evidence bags, rural terrain, interrogation rooms, and the exhausted hearts of people who had learned to measure time by dread. Now it entered the formal architecture of justice, a place built to replace chaos with sequence, grief with testimony, and outrage with procedure. But no courtroom, however solemn, can truly contain the emotional force of a murdered child's case. It can only try to discipline that force into a record the law can use. In the proceedings against Richard Allen Davis, that discipline mattered enormously. Because this was not simply a prosecution, it was a reckoning between a community and the man who had stepped into one child's room and altered countless lives. Courtrooms often appear orderly from the outside: wood paneling, microphones, counsel tables, the raised bench, jurors in their assigned places, the muted choreography of objections and exhibits. All of it suggests structure. And structure is part of the point. The law creates ritual because ritual keeps raw feeling from taking over completely. Yet in a case like this, the ritual always sits over something volcanic. Polly's family entered that space carrying far more than legal interest. They carried absence. They carried the image of a 12-year-old girl who should have been growing older instead of being represented by photographs, exhibits, and witness recollections. Mark Klaas, who had become one of the public faces of the search and the grief that followed it, now had to watch the system he hoped would punish Davis work at the pace and in the language of law. That is one of the hardest transitions for families. During the search phase, emotion feels useful: pleading, speaking, mobilizing, showing the child's face to the world. All of it can be action. In court, emotion must sit still while strangers take turns naming the worst thing that ever happened to you. The prosecution's task was to take a case already burned into public memory and reduce it to proof strong enough to survive scrutiny. Public certainty is not legal certainty. A community may know in its bones who the monster is, but a conviction demands more than moral conviction. It demands evidence, authentication, witnesses, chains of custody, forensic testimony, timelines, corroboration, and a story of guilt that does not merely feel true, but can be demonstrated piece by piece. In the Klaas case, the prosecution had that structure. They had the evidence connecting Davis to Polly. They had the testimony about the abduction from the bedroom. They had the physical and forensic links developed during the investigation. Most devastatingly, they had the fact that Polly's body had been located after Davis directed authorities to the site. The courtroom, therefore, became the place where a private nightmare was translated into prosecutable fact. Witnesses would have recreated the night in the careful, merciless order the law requires. The children who survived the bedroom encounter had to exist in that process not merely as traumatized girls, but as witnesses whose memory of a knife, a face, a voice, and a forced departure could be placed before a jury. There is a particular cruelty in that demand. The justice system needs testimony, but testimony asks people to revisit the point at which terror entered their lives. For child witnesses especially, the courtroom can feel like a second invasion. More controlled and more civilized than the first, yet invasive all the same. Their fear, once wordless and immediate, had to be broken into answers. That process was necessary. and still brutal. Investigators and forensic experts then had to do the opposite kind of work. Where the child witnesses carried emotional immediacy, the professionals carried procedural clarity. They explained the scene, the evidence, the recovery, the connections, the methods by which the defendant had been identified and linked to the crime. In a murder trial, such testimony performs an essential moral function. It refuses to let the defense reclassify horror as uncertainty. It says this happened. Here is how we know. Here's the chain from act to actor, with every witness. The prosecution tightened that chain around Davis. The defense, by contrast, occupied the strange and often hated role that criminal justice nevertheless requires. Even in the most monstrous cases, the defendant is entitled to representation, challenge, and the testing of the state's proof. That principle can feel intolerable to grieving families, but it is one of the things that distinguishes punishment from vengeance. In practical terms, the defense could try to undermine credibility, introduce doubt, question sequence, challenge interpretation, and force the prosecution to prove every element rather than coast on the emotional force of the crime. Yet there are cases in which the evidence carries a density that makes doubt feel more like strategy than possibility. The Polly Klaas case was one of them. Davis could sit in court, physically present. While the law assembled his guilt around him, that image matters. A man who once controlled the night through fear was now pinned in place by process, unable to move the narrative with a knife, unable to command silence, forced instead to listen as the state named him not as a terrifying intruder, but as a defendant. Still, the courtroom was not morally neutral ground. Davis brought his own presence into it, and his presence was repellent. His behavior during the legal proceedings only deepened public revulsion. Some offenders shrink in court, discovering too late that notoriety has no real glamour once it is surrounded by sheriffs, jurors, and transcripts. Others retain a grotesque sense of performance. Davis belonged to the latter category. There was something chilling in the way he inhabited the courtroom. As if the suffering around him existed at a distance he did not recognize as human. In murder cases, jurors watch more than evidence. They watch demeanor. They watch whether the accused appears frightened, arrogant, detached, mocking, vacant, manipulative. Demeanor is not proof, but it contributes to the psychic weather of the trial. In this case, that weather was darkened by the defendant himself. For Polly's family, each court date would have come with its own ritual of endurance. Arriving at the courthouse, seeing cameras, walking through security, taking a seat, waiting for the legal machine to begin its day. All of it requires a kind of strength that does not look dramatic from a distance. It is the strength to remain in the room while your child becomes evidence. It is the strength to hear strangers discuss her last hours with professional composure. It is the strength to look, if only indirectly, at the man who took her life and refused to let your own pain collapse into helplessness. Mark Klaas, in particular, emerged from this period not only as a father shattered by loss, but as someone increasingly unwilling to let the system hide behind abstract language. The trial was about one defendant, but it sat in the shadow of a larger public realization. Davis had not been unforeseeable. He had been allowed. He had a history. He had prior opportunities to harm. He had been processed through institutions that repeatedly failed to hold him. That truth gave the courtroom drama a wider social charge. The prosecution was not just proving a murder. The trial was exposing a sequence of official failures that made the murder possible. As evidence unfolded, the emotional outline of the crime would have sharpened for the jury in unbearable ways. This was not a case of sudden fight, mutual chaos, or interpretive ambiguity. This was an adult man entering a home, terrifying children, abducting a 12-year-old girl, and ending her life. The simplicity of that predation is part of what made it so morally overwhelming. Complex cases sometimes invite intellectual distance. This case did not. It demanded moral clarity, yet legal clarity still had to be earned through the ordered presentation of proof. That is how criminal courts transform private certainty into public judgment. The penalty phase carried its own gravity. Because this was a capital case, the question before the jury eventually widened beyond guilt to punishment. In such moments, the courtroom becomes a place where society tries to speak in the largest moral terms available to it. Is this a life that can remain among the living? Is this a crime that calls for the ultimate penalty? Families often entered this phase with emotions too layered for simple summary. Some want death immediately and without qualification. Some experience the death penalty as another form of time, another extension of the offender's presence. Some feel both things at once. In the Klaas case, the scale of public outrage made a death sentence feel, to many observers, like the only punishment proportionate to the crime and to the offender's history. The prosecution would have emphasized aggravating factors: the brutality of the offense, the age and vulnerability of the victim, the terror inflicted on the other girls, and Davis's long criminal record. The defense, in capital litigation, must attempt even then to present mitigation, scraps of humanity, background, or disorder that might persuade jurors to choose life without parole instead of death. The system insists that even the worst defendant be treated as human enough to sentence carefully. Families often hear this not as principle, but as insult, because the child they loved was not granted any such careful mercy. Yet the trial had to proceed through that tension. That is what legitimacy requires. When the verdict came, it did not restore order in the sentimental sense. No verdict can do that. The return of guilty does not reopen a bedroom and place the missing child back inside it. It does not give parents another birthday, another school year, another ordinary afternoon. What it does is something colder but essential. It fixes responsibility in law. It removes from the offender the ability to pretend that what happened is unproved, arguable, or dissolved into rumor. In the Polly Klaas case, a guilty verdict meant the man who had haunted Petaluma, horrified the nation, and annihilated one family's future would now be named permanently by the justice system for what he was. The later sentence of death carried its own symbolic force. It was the state's declaration that Richard Allen Davis had crossed every boundary by which civic life recognizes a person as fit to remain free. The sentence also reflected a society trying, through its harshest legal instrument, to answer the enormity of what had been done to Polly. In the courtroom, that answer would have landed in silence before it became language. There is often a pause around verdicts and sentences that feels larger than the room itself, a pause in which all the waiting, all the grief, all the testimony, and all the years of fear gather into one suspended moment. Then the words are spoken, and the room changes again. Families cry, go rigid, bow their heads, stare ahead. Attorneys become motionless. The defendant absorbs the sentence or performs indifference toward it. Reporters write quickly. Deputies stand by. The law moves on to its next procedural stage. But for the people at the center, time seems to fracture.